She was sitting on a guardrail on the side of Route 7 outside of Chattanooga, Tennessee, on a Tuesday afternoon in July, with a duffel bag at her feet and one hand on her stomach, and the other hand holding a phone with a dead battery, and she was not crying. She had been crying for the 40 minutes she had been sitting on the guardrail, from the moment Derek Holt's truck had pulled away until approximately 10 minutes ago, when she had run out of the kind of crying that has sound in it, and moved into the kind that is just a state of being, a condition the body maintains without performance, tears without effort, face wet without drama. She was 26 years old. She was 7 months pregnant. The duffel bag at her feet contained what Derek had thrown out of the truck before he drove away, which was most of her clothes and her toiletries, and a photograph of her mother, and a paperback novel she'd been reading, and had not finished, and would not finish for a long time because every time she picked it up after this, she would remember where she had been when she put it down. The rest of her things, the things that had been at Derek's apartment for 14 months, were either still there or gone. She didn't know which, and did not have the resources at this precise moment to think about. She had $43 in her checking account. She had a dead phone. She had a duffel bag. She had 7 months of pregnancy in her body, which meant she was tired in the particular bone-deep way of late pregnancy, and had been standing for most of the previous 2 hours during the argument that had preceded Derek's decision, and her lower back had the specific ache of someone who needed to sit down, and had been sitting on a metal guardrail for 40 minutes, which was not the same thing as actually sitting down. Her name was June Calloway, and she had grown up in Macon, Georgia, and come to Chattanooga at 24 for a job in a dental office that she had gotten and kept and was good at, and she had met Derek Holt 8 months before the pregnancy, and moved in with him after 4 because the lease on her apartment had ended, and he had said it made sense and she had wanted it to make sense and had organized her believing around the wanting for 14 months until a Tuesday afternoon in July when she could not organize it anymore, and had said so, and Derek had said some things in response that she would not repeat, not ever, to anyone, and had then told her to get her stuff and gotten in the truck and driven. He had not driven far. He had driven 12 miles and pulled over and put the truck in park and reached across her and opened her door. She had sat for a moment looking at the open door and the side of the road and the guardrail and the trees beyond it, and had understood that this was the full inventory of what was available to her, and had picked up her duffel bag and gotten out. He had pulled away before she was fully standing. She sat on the guardrail and her phone died at the 40-minute mark, and she thought about what to do and found that what to do was not immediately available as a thought, that the thinking part of her was taking a brief necessary leave following the events of the afternoon. And so she sat. She put her hand on her stomach because the baby was moving, which the baby did when she was stressed, which her doctor had told her was normal, which she found both reassuring and heartbreaking. The idea of a person inside her responding to her distress with movement as if to say, I am here, I know. She sat on the guardrail with her hand on her stomach and her dead phone and her duffel bag and the afternoon heat and the sound of occasional traffic on Route 7, and she looked at the road and waited for the thinking part to come back. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from, and if you have ever been on a side of a road, literally or otherwise, with nothing in the direction you came from and nothing visible ahead. Subscribe, because someone is about to stop. And the stopping is everything. The motorcycle came from the north. She heard it before she saw it, the specific sound of a single engine on a long road, not a group, just one, coming at highway speed and then slowing, which she noticed without fully processing the way you notice sounds when you are in the state she was in, registering them without weight. The bike slowed further. She looked up. It was pulling onto the shoulder. She had a moment of the particular alertness of a woman alone on the side of a road when a vehicle stops. The assessment that happens before anything else. The reading of available information for what it means. The man who got off the motorcycle was large, 50 or so. A dark beard going gray. A leather vest over a plain white t-shirt. He moved without hurry and without the performance of purposefulness, just moved. The way people move when they are doing something that seems obvious to them. He looked at her and said, "You okay?" She looked at him. She said, "My phone is dead." She said it first because it was the most immediately practical problem and because she was a person who went to practical things when the other things were too large. He said, "Do you need to call someone?" She thought about who she would call. Her mother was in Macon. Her two close friends in Chattanooga were both at work. She had her boss's number memorized, which suddenly struck her as an absurd thing to know and not know how to use. She said, "I need to call someone, but I don't know who yet." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "How long have you been sitting here?" She said, "A while." He looked at the duffel bag. He looked at her hand on her stomach. He did not ask questions that were not his to ask. He said, "Is there somewhere you need to be?" She said, "Not right now." He said, "Are you hurt?" She said, "No." He said, "When's the baby due?" She said, 9 weeks. He nodded. He said, "It's 94 degrees." He said it without drama, just as relevant information. He said, "I've got water in the pack." He indicated the saddlebag. He said, "And I've got a phone you can use whenever you're ready." He sat down on the guardrail. Not right next to her. 2 feet of space between them, the space of someone who understands that proximity needs to be chosen, not imposed. He did not say anything further. He just sat. She looked at him sitting on the guardrail beside her in the 94-degree afternoon and felt something break open in a way that was different from the crying of the previous 40 minutes. Something quieter and more complete. The specific giving way that happens when you have been holding yourself alone in something and someone sits down next to it. She said, "He left me here." The man said, "I know." She said, "I'm 7 months pregnant and he left me on the side of the road." He said, "I know." He did not say "I'm sorry" or "that's awful" or any of the things people say that are true, but insufficient. He just confirmed what she said the way you confirm things that are real and don't need decoration. She said, "I don't know what to do." He said, "You don't have to know right now." He said, "Right now you need water and a phone and somewhere to sit that isn't a metal guardrail in 94-degree heat." He said, "The rest comes after that." She looked at him. She said, "Why did you stop?" He said, "Because you were sitting on a guardrail on the side of Route 7 in July." He said it like the answer was in the question, like there was no version of that situation that ended with him not stopping, which was, she would come to understand later, not a performance of virtue, but an accurate description of how he moved through the world. He said, "My name's Boone." She said, "June." He said, "June." He said it like it was worth saying. He got up and got the water from the saddlebag and handed it to her, and she drank half of it without stopping, and he handed her his phone, and she sat with it for a moment trying to remember what the first step was. He sat back down on the guardrail. He looked at the road. He did not watch her figure it out. He gave her the privacy of his looking away, which was the right thing, and she felt it as such. She called her friend Marcy. Marcy answered on the 3rd ring, and June said, "I need help." Marcy said, "Where are you?" June looked at the road. She said, "Route 7, I think, around mile marker 34. There's a guardrail and trees, and..." Marcy said, "I'm coming." She said, "Don't hang up." June said, "My phone is dead. I'm on someone's." She looked at Boone. He said, "Keep it." She said to Marcy, "I'll keep the line open." Marcy said, "June, are you okay?" June said, "Not right now." Marcy said, "Are you safe?" She looked at the man on the guardrail. She said, "Yes, I'm safe." His name was Boone Lattimore. He was 52 years old. He had grown up in Chattanooga, had left at 19, had come back at 34 when his mother got sick, had stayed because she needed him, and then because Chattanooga had become the place he knew how to be again, after years of being in places that didn't fit quite right. He ran a contracting business, residential and small commercial, the kind of work that began with something that needed fixing and ended with it fixed, which suited a man of his particular disposition. He had 3 employees and a reputation that was built on the simple and reliable fact that he showed up when he said and finished what he started and told people the truth about what their house needed, whether or not the truth was what they'd been hoping to hear. He had been a member of the Mountain Road MC for 14 years, a club of 11 men and their families who had in common a commitment to showing up for their community that expressed itself in the practical and unglamorous ways that actual help usually expresses itself. Food drives and emergency response and the work of being visible and reliable in the places that needed visible and reliable people. He had been married once to a woman named Patricia for 6 years, ending not badly but ending. The way things end when two people have been honest with themselves about a mismatch for long enough that the honesty requires action. He had a daughter named Willa who was 24 and lived in Nashville and was doing a residency in social work, and who called her father every Tuesday, which was the day she called because she had said when she started the residency that Tuesdays were the hardest day, and she wanted something good in them, which Boone had received as the compliment it was and honored every Tuesday without fail for 2 years. He was not a man who had practiced goodness as a concept. He was a man who had practiced it as a behavior, repeatedly and without audience, and it had become the shape of how he moved, which was why stopping on Route 7 had not been a decision that required deliberation. It was just the next thing. It was just what you did when you saw a woman 7 months pregnant sitting on a guardrail in July with a dead phone in a duffel bag. You stopped, and you sat down, and you gave her water and a phone, and you waited. Marcy arrived in 32 minutes. She was a woman of June's age, small and direct, with the focused energy of someone who had dropped what she was doing completely and driven with purpose and arrived ready to do whatever came next. She got out of the car and looked at June and said, "Oh, honey," and then seemed to decide that honey was insufficient and crossed to the guardrail and put her arms around June and said nothing further, which was the right call. Boone stood up and moved a few steps away to give them space. After a moment, Marcy looked at him. She said, "You stopped?" He said, "Yes." She looked at him with the assessment of a woman who has learned to read the difference between people who help and people who perform helping. She said, "Thank you." He said, "She's going to need somewhere to go tonight." Marcy said, "She's coming home with me." He said, "Good." He looked at June. He said, "You've got somewhere to go." She said, "Yes." He said, "Good." He reached into the inside pocket of his vest and found a card, the kind that is simple and functional, his name and number and the name of his business. He held it out to her. He said, "If you need anything in the next few days, call." He said, "Not a general offer." He said, "Specific. If you need a ride somewhere or something moved or someone to make a call you don't want to make alone, call." June took the card. She looked at it. She said, "Why?" He said, "Because you're going to have a lot of next few days ahead of you and you shouldn't have to do all of them alone." He said, "You've got people." He looked at Marcy. He said, "But extra doesn't hurt." He got back on his bike. He said, "Take care of yourself, June." She said, "Thank you, Boone." He nodded. He started the engine. He pulled back onto Route 7 heading north. She watched him go with the card in her hand and the water bottle half empty, and her duffel bag at her feet and Marcy's arm around her shoulders, and felt, underneath everything that the afternoon had been, the small and specific warmth of having been stopped for, of having been seen on the side of a road and having someone sit down. She called him 4 days later. She almost didn't. She had the card on the kitchen table at Marcy's apartment where she was staying in the spare room that Marcy had cleared, with an efficiency that said this had been an option Marcy had been prepared to make real for longer than June had known. She looked at the card in the mornings. She thought about the offer, specific, he had said, if you need a ride or something moved or someone to make a call you don't want to make alone. She needed to go to Derek's apartment and get her things, the things that were still there or gone. She needed to know which. She did not want to go alone. She did not want to ask Marcy because Marcy had already done so much, and June was a woman who had been counting other people's patience since childhood, measuring what she was taking against what she was allowed, which was its own separate thing she would have to address eventually, but was not the most pressing item. She picked up the card. She called. He answered on the second ring. She said, "It's June from the guardrail." He said, "I know." She said, "I need to go get my things from an apartment." She said, "I don't want to go alone." He said, "When?" She said, "Saturday morning." He said, "I'll be there at 9. She said, "You don't know where Marcy's apartment is." He said, "Tell me." She told him. He said, 9 o'clock. He said, "Are you doing okay?" She said, "Some moments." He said, "That's enough for right now." She said, "I know." She said it the way she said things she was working on believing. He showed up Saturday at 9 in a truck, not the bike, which she understood was a practical choice for moving things, and which also, she thought, was a considered one. A man who had thought about what this morning required and had chosen accordingly. He had a brother with him, a man named Cal who was quieter than Boone and did not waste words and who carried boxes with the efficiency of someone for whom the physical work of helping is a natural language. They went to the apartment. Derek was not there, which June had not been sure about, and which the not being there was a relief she felt physically, a release of held tension in her shoulders and her jaw. The door was unlocked, which meant Derek had expected her at some point and had left the door rather than face the coming. She went through the apartment and took what was hers and left what was his, and was honest with herself about the line between them when the line was unclear, which it was in several places. Boone and Cal carried things to the truck without comment on the things or the apartment or anything that was not logistics. At one point, June stood in the kitchen holding a set of dish towels and trying to remember if they were hers or Derek's, and couldn't remember, and the not remembering was somehow worse than anything else that morning. The idea that she had lived in a place for 14 months and couldn't remember whose dish towels were whose, and she stood there holding them and the tears came back, not loudly, just the leaking kind. Boone came in for a box and saw her. He said, "Bring them." He said, "Whatever you're not sure about, bring it." He said, "You can sort it out later when it costs you less to think." She looked at him. She said, "They might be his." He said, "He left a 7 months pregnant woman on the side of Route 7. He can buy dish towels." She looked at the dish towels. She put them in the box. She almost smiled. It was the first thing that had come close to a smile in 4 days, and it felt strange in her face, like a room that had been closed a long time and was being aired out. Cal came through for another box and looked at her face and said nothing, but gave a small nod that meant he had seen the almost smile and registered it as information. They loaded the truck. They left. She did not look back at the apartment building when they drove away. She looked forward. It was a thing she was practicing. Comment below. Tell me, have you ever had someone show up for you in a way that cost them nothing but meant everything? I want to know. She had the baby on a Tuesday morning in September. 6 hours of labor in a room at Erlanger Medical Center in Chattanooga with Marcy on one side, and her mother, who had driven up from Macon and arrived at 2 a.m. and had been in the chair in the corner ever since, being exactly the presence that mothers are when they are good at being mothers, which June's was. The baby was a girl. June had known she would be a girl and had not told anyone because she had not wanted the knowing to become a shared thing, until the girl was real and present and in the room. She was real and present and in the room at 9:47 on a Tuesday morning, and she was 7 pounds 4 ounces, and she had dark hair and the specific unfocused intensity of a person who has just arrived somewhere completely new and is taking initial inventory. June held her and said her name, which was Clara, which she had decided on alone and was not sharing the decision-making of, which was the first decision she had made entirely on her own terms in 14 months, and which felt like something solid under her feet after a long time of uncertain ground. Her mother cried. Marcy cried. June looked at Clara and felt the full weight of everything the previous 2 months had been, and felt it transform in her arms into something that was not heavier than she could carry, but was exactly as heavy as it needed to be, which was heavy enough to be real, and not so heavy she was alone in it. She called Boone from the hospital that afternoon. She wasn't sure why she called him, and then she was sure, which was that he had been there at the beginning of what Clara's life would mean outside of June's body, and she wanted him to know that Clara was here. He answered. She said, "She's here." He said, "Yeah?" She said, 7'4", dark hair. He said, "She okay?" June said, "She's perfect." He said, "You okay?" She said, "I'm really okay." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Good." He said it the way he said things that mattered, simply and without performance. And she felt it land the way simple, true things land when you are in a state of being very open to them. He said, "Willa's been asking about you." She said, "Your daughter?" He said, "She does social work." She paused. She said, "Are you connecting me to a social worker?" He said, I'm telling you that a person who knows resources and has been hearing about you for 2 months is available if you want her. He said, her number or not, it's up to you. June thought about it. She said, give me her number. He said, I'll text it. She said, Boone. He said, yeah. She said, thank you for stopping. He was quiet for a moment. He said, thank you for sitting on that guardrail long enough for me to come by. She laughed, Clara startled at the sound. June looked at her daughter, startling at the first laugh she'd heard. She said, I have to go. He said, go. He said, call if you need anything. She said, I will. She was learning to say that and mean it. She was getting better at it. She hung up and looked at Clara and thought about Route 7 and the guardrail and the dead phone and the water and the man who had sat down 2 feet away and given her the space to figure out who to call. She thought about dish towels and Cal's nod and the almost smile in Derek's kitchen. She thought about what it meant that a stranger had stopped and had kept stopping, had not done one good thing and moved on, but had continued to be available in the specific and practical ways that availability actually means. She thought about what she wanted to build from here, what kind of life, what kind of mother, what kind of person, and felt for the first time in 2 months that the building was possible, that the ground under it was real, that she had people, and that having people was not a debt she owed but a truth about how humans were supposed to move through things. She looked at Clara. Clara was asleep. She had done the work of arriving and was resting from it, which seemed correct, which seemed like good judgment. June held her and rested too. Willa Lattimore called the following week. She was warm and direct in the way of her father without being her father, her own specific version of the quality, and she asked June what she needed in the way of someone who knew what people in June's situation usually needed and had the resources to connect them to some of it. She was not June's caseworker. She was not official in any capacity. She was a woman with knowledge and a phone, and a father who had texted her about a woman on a guardrail in July and who had been thinking about her since. She connected June to a housing resource program that had a unit coming available in October in a neighborhood near the dental office, a 2-bedroom manageable, the kind of place that could become a home with some time and some intention. She connected her to a program for new mothers that provided practical support in the first 3 months, the exhausted and logistically complex months, the ones where having someone bring a meal or sit with the baby for 2 hours while you sleep is not a luxury but a genuine condition of survival. She connected her to a legal aid organization that dealt with family law matters, which was relevant because Derek's legal relationship to Clara was a thing that needed to be defined correctly and on June's terms before it was defined on his, if it was going to be defined at all, which was June's decision to make and no one else's. June received all of this with the particular gratitude of someone who has been trying to do things alone for long enough that being handed a resource feels like being handed oxygen. She thanked Willa. Willa said, "My dad's good at finding people who could use a Willa in their life." June said, "Is that what he does?" Willa said, "He stops." She said, "He's always stopped." She said, "When I was little, I used to get frustrated because we could never be somewhere on time because he was always stopping for things on the way." She paused. She said, "I understand it now." June said, "What do you understand?" Willa said, "That being on time is less important than stopping." She said, "That the stopping is the thing." June sat in Marcy's spare room with Clara asleep in the portable crib Marcy's mother had contributed and thought about that. She thought, the stopping is the thing. She thought about all the cars that had passed on Route 7 in the 40 minutes before Boone's motorcycle. She did not count them because she did not know how many there had been, but she knew there had been some. She had heard them, and none of them had stopped, and she did not judge them for it because she understood that not stopping is what people do. It is the default. It is the path of least friction, and that stopping is the deviation, the choice against the current, the thing that has to be actively chosen. She thought about what it meant that Boone Lattimore had been someone who stopped. Not once, repeatedly. On Route 7 and at Derek's apartment and at the hospital with a text and through Willa. She thought about what kind of person develops that, what years of practice produce a man who stops so consistently it becomes his nature. She thought about her daughter asleep in the portable crib and what she wanted Clara to be and understand and know how to do, and felt, as she thought about it, that stopping was very high on the list. Stopping for people on the side of things, being the deviation from the current. Choosing it actively and repeatedly until it becomes the shape of how you move. She moved into the apartment in October. Clara was 6 weeks old and had opinions about everything already, which June chose to interpret as a character trait rather than a parenting challenge. The Mountain Road MC showed up on moving day. Not just Boone. The chapter. 8 men with a truck and tools, and the combined efficiency of people who have done this together before for other people and know how to do it without making it a production. They moved her boxes. They assembled the crib, which had instructions in 4 languages, none of which were English, but which Boone and a man named Dennis resolved with the practical competence of people who fix things for a living. They put together the bookshelf. They checked the smoke detector. One of them, a quiet man named Pete, whose wife had come too, installed a new lock on the front door because the existing one was loose, which June had not mentioned, and he had noticed, and he installed it without comment or credit. Just did the thing that needed doing because he was a man who noticed when things needed doing and had the tools. Pete's wife, a woman named Marie, held Clara for 2 hours while June directed traffic, which Clara submitted to with the equanimity of an infant who has already assessed this person as trustworthy, which June observed and took note of because Clara had good instincts and June was learning to pay attention to them. By afternoon, the apartment was assembled. It looked like a place where someone was going to live. It looked like a beginning. June stood in the kitchen, which was small and had a window over the sink that got afternoon light, and looked at the people in her living room, the men from the chapter talking among themselves, and Marie and Marcy and her mother, who had stayed another week because she had decided to stay another week and June had let her, and felt the specific fullness of a life that had been stripped to the guardrail and the duffel bag and the dead phone, and had been rebuilt, not by her alone, which she had always tried to do before, but by the accumulated presence of people who had stopped. She went and found Boone, who was on the small porch looking at the street. She stood next to him. She said, "I don't know how to thank you for this." He said, "You don't have to thank me for this." She said, "I do, though." He said, "June." He said, "You were on a guardrail in July." He said, "You're in your own apartment in October with a 6-week-old daughter who has opinions." He said, "That's you, not me." She said, "You stopped." He said, "Yeah." He said, "But you did everything after." She looked at the street. She said, "I called you, though." He said, "Yes." She said, "That was the hardest part." He looked at her. He said, "Harder than the guardrail?" She said, "The guardrail was done to me." She said, "Calling was something I did." She said, "I've been not calling people my whole life." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "How does it feel? Calling?" She thought about it. She said, "Like something I should have learned earlier." He said, "You're learning it now." She said, "Better late." He said, "Considerably." She met Willa in November. Willa drove down from Nashville on a Saturday and they had lunch at a place near the apartment and talked for 3 hours in the way of 2 people who have been prepared for each other by a mutual third person and are discovering that the preparation was accurate. Willa was warm and precise and had her father's quality of listening fully before speaking, which June had come to recognize as the hallmark of a certain kind of person and which she was trying to cultivate in herself. Willa held Clara with the ease of someone who held babies professionally, and Clara grabbed her finger and did not let go for 40 minutes, which Willa submitted to cheerfully. June looked at this, at Willa's finger in Clara's grip and Clara's complete certainty about the arrangement, and thought about 7 months pregnant on a guardrail, and a man sitting down 2 feet away, and a card in his vest pocket, and a phone that was not hers, and everything that had followed. She thought about the chain of it, the links, how each one had required someone to stop or call or show up or sit down, and how without any single link the chain did not reach from the guardrail to this lunch table and Willa's finger in Clara's grip. She thought about what she wanted Clara to know when Clara was old enough to know things. She thought about what the story was. She thought that the story was not about Derek, though Derek was in it. It was not about the guardrail, though the guardrail was where it started. It was not about her alone, though she was the one who had done the work. The story was about stopping. It was about the man who stopped and the chain of stopping that followed, the way one person choosing to deviate from the current gave permission or created the conditions, or simply demonstrated the possibility that deviation was available, that the current was not the only option, that you could pull over on Route 7 in July and sit down on a guardrail with a stranger and give her water and say you don't have to know right now, that this was a thing human beings could do for each other, that it was available, that it was chosen, that it could be chosen, that she could choose it too, that Clara could grow up knowing it was a choice, that this was the inheritance worth leaving, not the dish towels and not the things from the apartment and not the $43 that had become less and more over the months, but this, the knowledge that stopping is the thing, that it is always available, that it costs less than it saves, that the people on guardrails are always there and you are always either stopping or not stopping. And the difference between those two choices is the whole story, the whole thing, the entirety of what it means to move through the world as the kind of person you would want to have come by on Route 7 on a Tuesday afternoon in July, with a dead phone and a duffel bag and a baby who already knew how to say, I am here, I know. What would you have done? If you had come around that curve on Route 7 and seen her on that guardrail, would you have stopped? Comment below. Be honest. I read every single one. If this story reached something in you, share it with someone today who needs to be reminded that stopping is a choice and it is always available and it is always worth it. Subscribe for more stories about the people who pull over, sit down, give water, stay. She was on a guardrail with everything gone. He stopped. And that was the beginning of everything that came after, which turned out to be more than either of them knew how to see from Route 7 in July. That is what stopping does. That is what it always does.